Today is from 2 Kings chapter 5 verses 1 to 14, and it is called the healing of Naaman. And so it goes like this. The king of Aram had a great admiration for Naaman, the commander of his army, because through him the Lord had given Aram great victories. But though Naaman was a mighty warrior, he suffered from leprosy. At this time, the Aramean raiders had invaded the land of Israel, and among their captives was a young girl who had been given to Naaman's wife as a maid. One day, the girl said to her mistress, "I wish my master would go see the prophet in Samaria. He would heal him of his leprosy." So Naaman told the king what the young girl from Israel had said, and said, "Go visit the prophet." The king said, "I will send a letter introducing you to take to the king of Israel." So Naaman started out carrying as gifts 750 pounds of silver, 150 pounds of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. The letter to the king of Israel said, "With this letter I present my servant Naaman. I want you to heal him of his leprosy." Well, when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes in dismay and said, "Am I God that I could give life and take it away? Why is this man asking me to heal someone with leprosy?" I can see that he's trying to pick a fight with me. But when Elijah, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes in dismay, he sent this message to him: "Why are you so upset? Send Naaman to me, and he will learn that there is a true prophet here in Israel." So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and waited at the door of Elijah's house. But Elijah sent a message out to him, and the message was, "Go and wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan River. Then your skin will be restored, and you will be healed of your leprosy." But Naaman became angry and stalked away. "I thought he would certainly come out to meet me. I expected him to wave his hands over the leprosy and call on the name of the Lord his God and heal me. Aren't there rivers of Damascus, the Abana and the Pharpar, better than any of these rivers here in Israel? Why shouldn't I wash in them and be healed?" So Naaman turned and went away in a rage. But his officers tried to reason with him and said, "Sir, if the prophet had told you to do something very difficult, wouldn't you have done it? So you should certainly obey him when he says simply, 'Go and wash and be cured.'" So Naaman went down to the Jordan River, and dipped himself 7 times, and as the man of God had instructed him, and his skin became as healthy as the skin of a young child, and he was healed. May God add his blessing to the reading of his word. So, I guess you can realize that we're going to talk about Naaman being cured of leprosy today. That was a pretty tough one to figure it out, wasn't it? So anytime I'm doing a study or something like that, I kind of want to know what's going on in the world at this time. So anytime you see the book of Kings, you know that this is sometimes after David was made king. Before that, they had judges that took care of things. The judges went from town to town and ruled on things. But when the last judge, whose name was Samuel, was the chief judge, the people of Israel said, "We want a king. We want to be like all the other kingdoms around us. We want a king." And so Samuel was the one who anointed Saul and David to be kings. And then David's son Solomon was the king after David. So judges, kings, and then after King Solomon was gone, there were hardly any good kings. The Saul, David, Solomon time was like the zenith of the empire of Israel. And after that, it faltered because they had no good kings. The kings didn't follow God. They they worshipped the idols of the kingdoms around them, and they intermarried with the Gentile folks around them, and God began to punish them. And actually, their kingdom divided into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom at one time. And the story, the account today takes place in the northern kingdom, about 80 years after the two divided. And God, in an effort to get these two to come together and begin to follow him again, was sending out prophets to the kingdoms to get them to turn back to God. But it was no avail, as we know. And this account of Naaman, like I said, happens about 80 years after it was divided. And some of the prophets you'll hear a lot about was one called Elijah. And Elijah is referred to a number of times in the New Testament. It's Elijah with a J. Now, he had an understudy, essentially, who was Elisha with an S. Elijah with an S was referred to one time in all of the New Testament. And it was by Jesus in Luke 4, 27 and 28. And at that time, Jesus was speaking of the healing of Naaman, the leper. So there must be something for us in this account today. So we're kind of a small group today. So this is good for me because this is a Sunday school kind of class, and that's the way I want to do it. So I might ask you questions later, and so feel free to speak up or ask me a question as we go. But I tend to use a say, mean, and use, one of the Bible study techniques I have heard of. And so I read the word to see what it says, and then I look at the meaning. You know, what are we supposed to get out of this? And then the most important is, how am I going to use this in my day-to-day life? And so as we go along, say, mean, and use is kind of what I'm looking at. And so if we look at the very first verse, it tells us that Naaman was the commander of the armies of the king of Aram. And if you look at it, it says, and through the Lord he had won many great victories. So Naaman is from Syria. He's not Jewish. He's a Gentile. And the Lord was working through Naaman and gave him great victories, even though he really didn't know anything about the Lord. So if we look at that, what does that kind of tell us? That kind of tells us that there are people out here, or maybe it's us, that God is working through, that he's going to use as an instrument for our benefit later on. I don't know how Oakley came up with this syringe to bring today, but that worked really well for me. So, and then after we look at the Lord was working through Naaman, in that second verse, we see that he was a mighty warrior and highly thought of, but he had leprosy. Now, we've all heard of leprosy. We've probably never seen it. But at this time, leprosy was a dreaded disease. It was very contagious. And so as it got worse, people had to go be sequestered into leper colonies. Matter of fact, I looked it up, and the last leper colony in the United States closed in 1955. It was in Louisiana. And the number, and it's controlled for the most part in the world today. I looked it up, and in 2021, there were just over 200,000 cases of leprosy in the world. Most of them, 60+% of them, were in India, and the other high places were in Africa and Malaysia, but less than 1% in the United States. Leprosy can be a really fast progressing disease, or it can be a slow one. So we don't know where Naaman was in his progress. It must not have been too bad if he was still leading troops and able to go in and see the king. But as this progresses, it affects the blood vessels and the nerves. And so the blood vessels begin to die away and the tissues die because they're not getting good nutrition. And if you see pictures of folks with leprosy, they'll have distortions of their face, their nose can fall off, their ears can fall off. They don't have fingers because those appendages die off first. And then it starts to move in and affect the internal organs, and they die a slow, painful death. That's essentially what it said. So as I kind of looked at this about leprosy, and I thought, okay, so Naaman had leprosy, and he knew what the outcome was going to be. And he wanted to get rid of this. So I thought, what else could be like the leprosy? And I thought, this could be like our sins. It may start off light and not too bad, like leprosy does, but it could certainly progress and just take over our lives. I just smoked a little dope, that won't bother me. Well, I might try a little cocaine. And then if you talk to any of these addicts, that's essentially what they'll all say. They'll say, I started off with just a little bit of this, and then it just progressed. Sometimes alcohol, the same things. Other things that take over us that lead to our demise could be like the leprosy that Naaman had. And so Naaman knew he had this leprosy, and he knew what was going to happen to him. I'm going to have a slow, painful death, and I want to get rid of it. And so he had an opportunity to go to God. We can do that too. So that was my first little point. We have things that in our lives that we just, it's real simple. We need to go to God. The second aspect I looked at this, second thing that kind of caught me was this little girl. There's 2 verses about this little girl. We don't even know what her name was. We know that she was kidnapped in a military raid. We don't know, is she an orphan now? Did they kill her parents when they took her away? We do know that she was Jewish. That's because that's who Syria was in. This kingdom of Aram was what is present-day Syria today. So I just looked in and thought, I hadn't brought that up, but it's present-day Syria. And they were doing war with the northern tribes. And the northern tribes at that time, as I just kind of said earlier, they were not following God. Okay. But if we look at this little girl, what can we tell about her? She knows Elijah, and she knows that he can heal her master. So even though the kingdom she's living in is not following God, it appears that she was probably being raised by God-fearing parents. And they had taught her about Elijah and that he could save. Now, I also looked at this little girl and I kind of thought, okay, what would Greg do that? If I had somebody who came in and stole me away, did something terrible to me, maybe killed my parents or something like that, and then I find out later on that this person who did this to me, what would I say? Greg would probably say, good, you deserved it. But what did this little girl do? She said, I wish that my master could go see the prophet in Samaria who could heal him of his leprosy. And she told him of that. So that is not what I would have done, but this little unnamed little girl certainly did. And she did something very simple that I'm sure that she probably learned from her parents. She cared for others more than herself. Gee, do we do that? Do we do that? And I have an interact. This is the question you guys have to answer here, if you can. Are there other people in the Bible that we've heard accounts of who were exiled or stolen away that influenced others toward God? Anybody got his example? Oh, Wayne shook his head. Joseph, right? Is that who you were going to say?
No, but
That's one? Daniel, exactly. Probably Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego also. Okay. Esther. Okay. So that was the big. That was the question. I may ask you more here as we go on later. So now let's go on to Naaman. Now Naaman takes up the majority of this chapter, this reading that we did. He's in verses 4 to 14, and what do we know about Naaman? We know he was not a Jew. We know that he was a successful warrior, and he was highly thought of by the king, and that he wanted to be healed. So we know that about him. And he knew he was facing a slow death. He wanted to be healed so badly that he took the advice of some little girl that was a servant to his wife and went to the king and said, I want to be healed. Can you allow me to go to Samaria to this prophet? So we also, as we look at this, we can see that Naaman was not a follower of God. He was pagan. He had to pay for times that he went to see so when he's going to go visit, I needed to bring gifts too. And I would almost imagine that the king probably helped him with the gifts. And so he took 750 pounds of silver and 150 pounds of gold and 10 sets of clothing. So yesterday I sat down at my calculator and I went to Friday's markets to see what the market value of silver was on Friday, and the 750 pounds of silver as of Friday would have been worth $648,000. The gold, 150 pounds of gold's at a new market high that said 150 pounds of gold is worth $10.2 million. And the clothing, who knows? I had no idea, but I thought the gold and silver was enough to prove that he was going and prepared to spend a lot of money for himself, to get himself healed. There's a lot about the king in there. The king, when I looked at it, I thought, this is truly a bad king. As I looked back in the notes and did some studies, it said this was probably King Joram, who would have been about that time. So he gets this letter, and he, instead of thinking about Naaman, who is here with all these gifts and wants to be healed of leprosy, he only thought of himself, oh, they're coming after me, they're going to attack me again. He never even considered saying that, hey, you need to go see the prophet Elijah, who I'm sure he knew of because Elijah was there trying to get him to straighten his ways out. So he never thought of anybody but himself. But Elijah heard and sent message to have Naaman come to his house. And so you can kind of see this here. It talks about Naaman and his caravan of donkeys and camels and chariots, and they're all going. So this is not a small thing. This is an important man coming through a foreign country, and everybody's going to probably know. This is a really important guy. Look at all this stuff he's bringing with him. And when Naaman gets to Elijah's house, what does Elijah do? He never even comes to the door. He sends a servant out to say, tell him to go wash himself in the Jordan River 7 times. And it says in the Bible that Naaman was angry and in a rage that, he didn't even come to the door. He didn't perform some ceremony. I could not wash myself in this dirty Jordan River. I could go to the better rivers in Damascus. But again, luckily, someone enlightens Naaman again. And one of his officers said, look, you've been offered a healing, and if they would have asked you to build a new temple or to conquer a city, you would have done that difficult thing to get this healing. But you have this simple thing to do. Wash yourself 7 times in the river, and you're upset. So Naaman had to kind of be slapped in the face to say, hey, look, you are not that important. You need to humble yourself. You think you're so valuable. Humble yourself and do this simple thing that God is offering you. And he goes to the Jordan River and bathes himself 7 times. And his skin is like that of a young child. So when we get done, go by and rub Kelsey's fingers and hands and see how soft they are. And that's what Naaman's skin would have been like. So, and Naaman realizes this, and in verse 15 comes back and says that he realizes that there is no God in the world except in Israel. So, this was all pretty simple, right? But there were a couple things that had to happen, you know. Naaman had to be enlightened by this little girl. His officers had to convince him that he needed to humble himself. And, you know, we kind of need to humble ourselves also. There's even a verse in James that says, humble yourself before the Lord and he will lift you up. James 4:10. But what struck me the most about this story was that this miracle was not in the method in which Naaman was cleansed, but in his obedience. It was not in the method, but it was in Naaman's humbleness and obedience to God that healed him of his leprosy. So then I thought back about, when I was a kid growing up, I went to a Pentecostal church. And there were lots and lots of rules in my Pentecostal church. You know, if you ever see Greg, he always has hair that's over his ears, because when I was a kid, it had to be a 1/4 inch above your ears. I was supposed to wear long sleeve shirts all the time. I could never wear shorts. The girls had to have dresses that were 6 inches below their knees. It was Christianity by yardstick, is what I've learned to call it. All of these rules. The Jews had 613 rules they had to all follow about ceremonies and festivals and food restrictions and doing business with Jews and doing business with Gentiles. They all had all these rules. But these rules all came from we humans. You know, we are the ones who make these rules. And I think as I read this verse today or this chapter today, or this account of Naaman, was that we humans make religion really, really difficult. We have rules on everything you have to do. There's rules on how you baptize somebody, forward or backwards, or sprinkle or dipping. There's rules everywhere. But really, if you go to Matthew chapter 22, verses 37 and verses 39, it says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with your mind. That is the key. That is the number one commandment. These were the scribes and Pharisees trying to trick Jesus, and they said, well, which is the commandment that's the most valuable? And it was this: love the Lord your God with all your heart and with your soul and with your mind. And the second is like this: love your neighbor as yourself. So those are the two rules that Jesus gave us. So we need to become more like Naaman. We need to humble ourselves and remember that it is not the method, but it is our obedience that gets us to God. We just need to learn to trust and obey. Amen.